Environmental justice focuses on identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse health outcomes in low-income and minority communities. One of these issues being addressed today is lead poisoning within homes. Lead poisoning became an issue in the early 1970s where it was identified as a health hazard in both the workplace and the home. Since then, it has remained a prevalent issue in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and while it is not something that is such a high concern today, it is still a health concern. To put this into a local perspective, the Columbus Dispatch released an article in 2014 stating that about 2.5 million homes were built in Columbus before the 1950s, and of these 2.5 million homes, it was obvious that lead was still being used within the homes.
Lead poisoning occurs when lead builds up in your body generally over several months of exposure, and exposure to even the smallest amounts of lead have been shown to cause serious health problems. Children under the age of 6 are most at risk for the effects of lead poisoning. Lead poisoning can severely affect mental and physical development, especially in children, and at high levels of exposure, lead poisoning can be fatal. Oftentimes, the symptoms of lead poisoning are hard to detect or may not even arise until extremely high levels of exposure have occurred. Lead-based paints and lead-contaminated dust in older buildings, especially those built before the 1970s, are the most common source of exposure. In most cases, lead poisoning in children occurs through the ingestion of lead-based paint chips from walls or toys. Other common exposure sources include contaminated air, water, and soil.
Lead exposure is far from equitable for children. Low-income and minority children bear a disproportionate burden of exposure to lead, primarily through lead-based paint found in older homes and through lead-contaminated water. According to the CDC, it has been found that for white children, lead levels have decreased within the last 10 to 20 years. However, the pattern of inequitable childhood lead poisoning in African American children remains the same. While most can agree that safe drinking water is a human right, not everybody in the U.S. has access to potable water. There is a failure of regulatory bodies to protect citizens from lead in water. Frank will talk about a very famous example of lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, but this is not an isolated example. There is a trend of lead-contaminated water among lower income and primarily Black neighborhoods. Right now in Michigan, there's another example of lead-contaminated water in Benton Harbor, a predominantly Black city. This began in 2018, and officials have said it will take 5 years to replace lead pipes. This means citizens will go 8 years without access to safe drinking water.
As we've been talking for the past few minutes about lead poisoning exposure in the EHS model, it is time we applied this to a case. We'll be looking at a famous case of environmental justice in Flint, Michigan. The case started when the city of Flint decided to switch their water supply from Lake Huron to the Flint River and then not treat the water with an anti-corrosion chemical to prevent lead particles from being released from the inside of their water pipes. Applying this to the EHS model for a moment, we have an environmental agent of lead that was transmitted through the water pipes and distributed through the city's water supply. Residents were then exposed to the lead by ingesting it, which can lead to chronic and acute lead poisoning. This then led to regional and then a national outcry due to the real and perceived risks of lead exposure. Disappointingly, though, it took the national outcry for the states and local political processes to start actually working on fixing the issue, and it took them an additional $400 million to correct it. This is thought to be a classic case of environmental injustice because of the long delays in addressing it. Robert Bullard, the Dean of Public Affairs at Texas Southern, compares the response in Flint to a gas leak that occurred in a predominantly white community near LA, where the states and local officials have been much more responsive to the issue. Environmental problems like Flint take longer to respond to and have a longer recovery time because they occur in communities of color and low-income communities as well. This difference in response time and recovery times makes this a prime example of an environmental justice case.
Despite the 1978 ban on lead paint in homes, lead poisoning remains a persistent threat to one's long-term health. Risk is not spread evenly, however. Though wealthy communities have been able to mobilize resources and take many preventative measures, disadvantaged communities like Flint, Michigan languish for years with lead leaching from their pipes and their paint. People of color are disproportionately at risk, more likely to both be exposed to and suffer health consequences from lead poisoning. Thankfully, political processes exist that attempt to rectify these disparate impacts. Here at Columbus Public Health, their Lead Safe Columbus program offers poor residents up to $9,300 to be spent controlling lead poisoning in their home. Societal processes like these are vital to enacting environmental protections, but slipping through the cracks is all too easy. Benton Harbor and Flint are forced to spend years without safe drinking water. How many Columbus residents know their risk of lead exposure or know that Lead Safe Columbus exists at all? Sweeping reform to confront lead poisoning is severely lacking, leaving tens of millions of families and children at risk.